Hello, Year 10 historians, and welcome to our second lesson on the Freedom Ride. So our learning goals for today are: know how the Freedom Ride was received. Hint, not very well. Wasn't received very well by the locals, but it did have a positive, lasting impact. You're going to know about the legacy of that 1965 Freedom Ride, and you're going to be able to match cause and effect. We're going to do an activity where you match cause and effect. Okay. A hostile reception, you know it. So, the people who went there, remember those university students from Sydney who went around rural New South Wales to highlight poverty in the Indigenous communities and racism. They got shouted at, they got spat on, they got hit. Poor old Charles Perkins got threatened, he got punched in the head, and he got egged. Someone put an egg down his... In another situation that might be funny, but not in this one. So here's a government website where they talk about the Freedom Rides. Commemorating the Freedom Ride. There you go. It went for 2 weeks in February 1965. There's their bus. There's that picture of them at the front. Student Action for Aborigines Organisation, SAFA. Here's a list of all the students. There you go. They were all aged 19 to 22, roughly. Oh, there's a 17-year-old there. Yeah, she in second year art. She must be very clever. And there's also 2 bus drivers. Sweet as. So they talk about the ride there, where it appeared in the newspaper. Yada yada yada. There's Charles Perkins there with some Indigenous people in rural New South Wales. So it's a very well documented trip, to say the least. There you go. So here's some of those people protesting racism during the Freedom Ride. Is colour contagious? I like it. Schools, hotels, clubs, integrated. Integrated, yeah. So think about the policy of integration there, but pools, segregated. Remember that some Indigenous kids were not allowed to swim in the swimming pool. Sucks. There you go. Equal at school, unequal at pool? Yeah. So there's a photo of some of those people protesting during the Freedom Ride. Right, this is our last slide of notes. Not too much for you today. So, the legacy of the Freedom Ride. What was the legacy of the Freedom Ride? Let's talk about that. It got national and international media attention, yeah. So it highlighted the racism in those areas, and it highlighted Indigenous poverty. Yep. So it's created awareness of the problem, and that is the first step to solving a problem, I guess. It forced Australia to confront racism and inequality within some of its communities. Some of the people that were on the Freedom Rides went on to have big careers. Charles Perkins, as we know, he was already a very successful person, first Indigenous person at university, and he also was a professional soccer player. He got the Order of Australia in 1987. Huge honour. Jim Spiegelman, another one who was on the Freedom Ride, ended up being the Chief Justice of the High Court in New South Wales. And another guy, Andrew, I'm going to say Rifshaug. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, whatever. He ended up being the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. Nice. So, a couple of months after they came back from the Freedom Rides, they had a few gatherings about it. There you go. Mr. Charles Perkins, president of the SAFA, the Students for Action for Aboriginals. I can't remember what that stands for anymore. And some other people. Yeah, so this was like a public meeting that they had a couple of months after the Freedom Ride. And here's an awesome quote from Charles Perkins. What we gave Aboriginal people in the towns we visited was hope. we stirred their imagination, their desire for human rights. What a guy. Sweet hairdo as well. Okay, our activity today. So you're now going to need to pause the video so you can copy this down. I want you to copy and complete this grid. So you can either use your knowledge or have a look at the textbook or use the internet. I've filled in either the cause or the effect, and you have to fill in the blanks. So the effect was Charles Perkins got awarded the Order of Australia. What caused that? Why did he get the Order of Australia? There was a lot of racism and Indigenous poverty in New South Wales. It was a cause. What was the effect of that? And lastly, some cinemas in New South Wales were partitioned by race. You had Indigenous people on one side, white people on the other. What caused that? So copy and complete that grid. Thanks. Okay, one of my favourite video series. It's Behind the News. Check this out.
50 years ago, a bunch of Sydney Uni students made history by travelling around New South Wales on a bus to protest against racial discrimination. It was called the Freedom Ride, and it stood up for Aboriginal people at a time when they weren't given the same rights as other Australians. Now that historic event has been recreated. Here's Tash, but first a warning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers. This story contains images of people who've died.
This was Australia in the 1960s. Coloured TV wasn't invented yet. And this was the most popular boy band around. But society was different in other ways too. Indigenous people didn't have the same rights as other Australians. They weren't counted as citizens, and they faced a lot of discrimination.
I was the first black to be permitted to go to the high school, and I was spat on every day.
But this guy, Charles Perkins, wanted to change that.
What are the most important aspects to you?
Well, I think
he was the first Aboriginal person to graduate from uni. He was also a big fan of American civil rights activist Martin Luther King.
I have a dream.
So, inspired by events King championed in the US, Charles organised a campaign he hoped would help. At midnight on the 12th of February 1965, Charles invited a big group of students to set off with him on a bus trip across country New South Wales to find out how Aboriginal people were actually being treated. It became known as the Freedom Ride. For 2 weeks, they travelled to outback towns and found Aboriginal people living in poor conditions. They were also being treated really badly. Segregation was everywhere. For example, Aboriginal people could only swim at local pools when other people weren't there. They weren't allowed to sit in restaurants, and if they went to the movies, they could only sit at the front. The students saw a lot of bad things during their trip that they wanted other people to see too. So they held protests as they went, which made the news. A lot of people didn't like what they were doing, and they were even chased out of one of the towns. But their trip did make a big difference to Indigenous rights. A couple of years later, a big vote called a referendum was held, and Australia voted to remove discrimination from the Constitution and to count Indigenous people as part of the country. 50 years on, many of the people from the original Freedom Ride are still around today. So to celebrate the anniversary of their trip, they decided to do it all again. Joining them were students from the same uni they all used to go to. And supporting the ride were young people like Sky.
Hey BTN, it's Sky here, and I am on the Freedom Ride to get a better understanding of what really happened in 1965.
They went to the same towns, meeting locals and visiting schools like this one in Walgett. While a lot has changed since 1965, some reckon there's still plenty to be done for Indigenous rights.
What I think a really great thing about this trip is to encourage this next generation to take off where they left off. There's still so much work to be done. There's still, like I said, we're not the lucky country yet. We still need to keep going.
The Freedom Ride helped change the way Indigenous people were treated in our society. And it was all thanks to a group of students on one important bus ride.
one more video for y'all today. This is just, it was called Charles Perkins' Freedom Ride. Anyway, check it out.
In 1965, this group of students, known as the Freedom Riders, hit the headlines when they took the struggle from the city to the bush. They bust their way through northwestern New South Wales, breaking down the barriers of prejudice and shattering the blissful ignorance of conservative country towns. When the Freedom Riders forced access to the artesian baths of Moree, racial tensions turned to violence. Overnight, Moree became a focus for the nation's growing guilt about the treatment of blacks in this country.
65 from Walgett after being forced out of Walgett by white people as a result of demonstrations at the RSL club there. And of course, the confrontations at the swimming pool at the time were very dangerous. Police had to form a type of a gauntlet for us to go into the town bars and then come out. We were pelted with eggs and bottles and broken glasses.
The whole freedom ride is not so much for the white people. On my mind, my deeper objective was for Aboriginal people to realise, hey, listen, second class is not good enough, you know. You don't have to always be first class, but don't always be second class. And don't cop shit, you know, when you don't have to. And you don't have to live on river banks and in shanty huts and at the end of a road where there's rubbish tip. Live in town. And you don't have to cop these white men sneaking around pinching Aboriginal women at night, you know. Sitting down the front of picture theatres, not being able to sit in a restaurant, because nobody allows you as an Aborigine to sit in a restaurant. That's not on. And, you know, and the timing was right. If I didn't do it, somebody else would have done it, and other people have done it in a different way.
Okay, today's reflection activity is, I want you to create an analogy. An analogy is trying to describe something like something else to help you remember it, to put it in your brain hole a bit better. So, the Freedom Ride in 1965, which made Australia confront racism and inequality, is like... ... So, let me give you an example of an analogy. Everybody remembers the movie Forrest Gump. And at the start, you got Tom Hanks sitting there on the park bench, and he's like, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Yeah, that's an analogy. He's drawing an analogy between life and a box of chocolates. So I want you to draw an analogy between the Freedom Ride and something else. Okay, it's the highlight of your life. Homework set by me. I want you to write a short, between 2 and 5 sentences long, diary entry pretending you were a person on the Freedom Ride. And in fact, you can find diary entries of people on the Freedom Ride online. There's also some in the textbook chapter for this topic that might give you some ideas. So I want you to write a short diary entry pretending that you were one of those people on the Freedom Ride, one of the students. For people who are keen as beans, here's some bonus homework. Read chapter 4.7 in your textbook and watch this. There you go. A little bit of a longer video about the Freedom Ride, but it's very, very worth it. Thank you so much for your awesomeness. Remember to keep it real.